Good morning. Welcome to All Out Politics. The UK Supreme Court has this morning given the go-ahead to the building of a third runway at Heathrow Airport. The verdict is a blow for environmental campaigners and reverses a decision by the Court of Appeal, which ruled the runway plans were unlawful because the then Transport Secretary Chris Grayling had failed to take the UK's climate commitments into account. But at a time when the airline industry has been decimated by the COVID pandemic, is the third runway ever likely to get off the ground? Let's go to our business correspondent, Paul Kelso, who is outside the Supreme Court. And Paul, first of all, what's the point of law that the Supreme Court have found in favour of this runway on?
Yeah, this is fascinating, Adam, because the Supreme Court, as you just said, has overturned a previous decision by the appeal court, which itself overturned the divisional court's original judgment in this. So we have, by my count, 10 judges, all of whom have reached differing interpretations of a single point of law, which is what constitutes government policy and how should it be taken into account, specifically government policy around the commitments in the Paris Climate Accord to try and keep global temperature rises below 2 degrees initially, and then that changed to 1.5 degrees initially. And essentially the argument of the environmental groups endorsed by the appeal court was that statements made by ministers in 2016 when the Paris Accord was adopted, Andrea Leibson and Amber Rudd, counted as government policy. And the appeal court found that was true. And so effectively Heathrow was stopped in its tracks. This court, the highest court in the land, has found that policy actually has to be much more tightly defined, and statements by ministers weren't enough to constitute a breach by Chris Grayling when he ruled that the Heathrow runway could go ahead. It's not to say the Paris Climate Accord will not be considered in the future consideration of Heathrow. There's a planning process to come, and the Supreme Court has made clear that climate considerations will have to be taken into account. But this is a disappointment, a major disappointment for environmental groups. Some expressed their dislike for the ruling by throwing red paint at the court. A young woman who was arrested who said that represents the blood on the hands of the judges, who interestingly aren't in the building. This was given remotely. Heathrow, of course, have a very differing view. This is good news for them. They've responded this morning. I'll give you a brief taste of their response. Heathrow, they say, has already committed to net zero, and this ruling recognises the robust planning process that will require us to prove expansion is compliant with the UK's climate change obligations, including the Paris Climate Agreement, before construction can begin. That acknowledges there is a long way to go before bulldozers start to roll into the villages that will be flattened to make room for this third runway. Talking of bulldozers, this judgment, of course, creates a problem for the Prime Minister. Boris Johnson famously said he would lie down in front of those bulldozers on behalf of his constituents in Uxbridge, one of the constituencies that will see construction. When he was Foreign Secretary, Adam, you'll remember, he flew all the way to Kabul to avoid a vote in the House of Commons that gave a big majority to approving this runway. Well, now he's in place at number 10. Ultimately, this decision will end up back on him and a Secretary of State who at some point will have to approve or not the runway decision. Interestingly, the government did not appeal against the Court of Appeal decision. They left it to the environmental groups. Grant Shapps, the Secretary of State, now said they were happy for this to be essentially a commercially led project. There's no public money directly in this third runway project. They wanted Heathrow to do the heavy lifting. Well, Heathrow have now won. They say they will commit and get this runway built. There are plenty, certainly amongst the lawyers acting on behalf of the environmental groups, who say it will never happen, not least because the skies are empty because of COVID, and that demand simply will not return to require a third runway. A long way to go, but decisions across the board in business and in politics about the third runway.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul Kelso. Well, let's get the reaction now of the former Shadow Chancellor, Labour's John McDonnell. His Hayes and Harlington constituency includes Heathrow. Thank you for joining us, Mr McDonnell. Your reaction to this Supreme Court ruling?
Disappointed, but I actually think it's most probably irrelevant now because the government's own target has moved on from early in the year. If you remember, the target was 2050 to achieve zero carbon emissions, net zero. They're now saying 68% carbon emission reduction by 2030. So actually, there's no way they'd be able to meet that target if they let the third runway go ahead. So I think what will happen now, there may well be further legal challenges against this decision, but I actually think the government now is in a position where it will rule out the third runway. And remember, Boris Johnson, he has his next door constituency to me, he opposes the third runway. In fact, he promised me and his constituency he'd lie down in front of the bulldozers if they try to push it ahead. So I actually think I regret the court decision today. But I think actually it's becoming almost irrelevant now. Things have moved on with regard to the political attitude toward tackling climate change.
So you dismissed that, what we've just heard, that statement from the Heathrow airport saying that they are moving towards net zero, even with this new airport, in terms of carbon emissions?
Well, unfortunately, I've heard that so many times before about their ambitions, and I'm sorry, they've lost credibility on this. The government's own climate change committee has made it very clear you couldn't have airport expansion in this way if you were going to meet the targets. And remember, the government, and I've welcomed this, the government has tightened the targets. I don't think they've gone far enough, but they have tightened the targets over the last few months. And so I think, as I say, the third runway now is looking like a white elephant. I'd rather Heathrow Airport. No, I support the airport. I want them to just make Heathrow better rather than bigger. And in that way, they can make their contribution towards the economy. But to actually threaten the homes of, you remember, Adam, it's up to 10,000 of my constituents would either lose their homes through demolition or have them rendered unlivable because of air pollution and noise pollution. But apart from that, this issue of climate change now overrides everything. Every decision in government now realistically has to take sustainability at its heart. And we're talking about the future of our planet. And as I say, the government has changed the targets and moved it on. They're much tighter now. So I think Heathrow has to come to terms with reality now and concentrate on making sure Heathrow itself is more efficient, more effective, and gets onto a proper green agenda rather than futilely wasting resources and energy on this expansion.
Well, I mean, at the same time, Heathrow has, we know, been clobbered by the COVID outbreak. It's gone into loss. Many of your constituents work at Heathrow. Yeah. Wouldn't going for a third runway bring jobs, prosperity, and actually improve the infrastructure?
Well, it's interesting about that because every time, like on the fifth terminal expansion, we were promised more jobs. In fact, we didn't. What happened, there was increased mechanization and we got less. The issue for us actually is let's do something that's realistic now. It's not realistic anymore to plan for a third runway because we know it's unsustainable given our climate change targets. So let's stop wasting our time on that and let's concentrate on making sure Heathrow itself is working effectively. And by that, I mean sitting down with the trade unions, with the local community, developing an environmental plan for the airport that's realistic. And I tell you also as well, I think it's a bit of a cheek, Heathrow Limited at the moment, to be talking about jobs when my constituents are actually on strike because Heathrow Limited are cutting their wages, undermining their conditions of work, using the pandemic as an excuse to do that. I think that's appalling. I'd rather they made sure that they sat down with the unions and with the local community and planned effectively. Let's work together on this rather than these pipe dreams about a third runway. It's time is gone. It's a white elephant.
On the pandemic, do you think there is a need now for tougher rules curbing Christmas?
Yes, I'm beginning to think that. I'm really worried. In our area, I'm a London MP, and I'm worried about the rise, and I'm worried about the loss of lives. I've said it time and time again. I understand the economic impact, but you can revive an economy. You can't resurrect the dead, and I'm really worried about the outcome. So yes, I think the government is going to have to bite the bullet, and I think actually people in themselves, in their own minds, are moving in that direction as well. But actually, what we don't want is to have a few days in which we're all coming together, and then there's a spike, and we start losing people again as a result of that. So yes, I'm afraid I'm a bit harder line on that now. I think we're going to have to say, yes, the rules have to be maintained. We're in third tier in London now, and I'm really worried. We've lost so many people, and there's been such human suffering now. Let's not ruin it now. When we've got the vaccine coming, and let's praise all those scientists and all those health workers and others who are delivering the vaccine to us now. Now it's coming. We're nearly there. Let's not spoil it now by relaxing the rules and then having another spike and having the potential of our NHS overwhelmed. So I err on the side of caution on this.
John McDonnell, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Nadim Zahawi, the minister responsible for the vaccine rollout.